That's 2,827 cases tallied in a span of 24 hours as of 12 a.m. And it's also more than 2,800 domestic transmissions alone, with 21 cases from abroad. So breaking it down by region, we've got close to 1,300 cases in the capital, Seoul, followed by 820 in Gyeonggi-do province and 161 in Incheon. Also here, 90 cases in the southern port city of Busan. Now, if we take a look at our graph now, we do see that over the weekend we had over 3,000 daily infections. With that, infections have been in the 3,000 level for the past 5 days. Although we do have a drop here this Monday compared to last Monday, it's an on-week surge by more than 800 infections. With that, Korea has accumulated 418,252 cases, and with 24 additional deaths, the death toll approaching 3,300. Now, the number of patients that are currently in serious to critical condition has been in the 500s for the past 3 days. Now, moving over to vaccination figures, 42.2 million people have received at least one COVID-19 jab, and close to 40.5 million are fully vaccinated. Let's move over to infection figures abroad. We've got a rise by close to 400,000 new infections in the past day, and here close to 4,400 fatalities. Now, meanwhile, the World Health Organization is warning of the rise in deaths in Europe, especially saying that there could be additional 500,000 deaths by March, that is, if urgent action is not taken. And over the weekend here, we see that Germany has surpassed Argentina in its total caseload of COVID-19 infections, and Poland now has more cases than the Ukraine, also a record that has been posted over the weekend. And those are the general updates that I have for now, but I'll see you back in a bit. Sunny?
All right, so thank you for now. On the domestic front, as part of phase 1 in our efforts to transition into a new normal, schools nationwide have fully reopened in-person instructions as of this Monday. For more on that, I have Kim Yeon-sung in the studio. Yeon-sung, welcome.
Happy to be here, Sunny.
Right, let's start with the full resumption of offline classes then.
Right, so to start us off, many schools outside the capital region have already resumed full in-class learning, but in the greater Seoul area, many caps and restrictions were in place because it was the area that has seen the most of the infections. But now from Monday, most middle school and high schools in the capital region had a 2/3 attendance cap, before Monday, while most elementary schools kept their attendance limited at 3/4 of the student body. Now, apart from a handful of schools that will keep restrictions in place due to the high number of students and staff, 97% of all schools in the greater Seoul region have decided to lift their previous attendance caps. Getting students back in schools has always been a part of the gradual easing of COVID-19 restrictions, but authorities had been extra wary of outbreaks ahead of last week's Sunung, or the national college entrance exams. To minimize the number of students infected, a lot of high schools went completely online for the few weeks leading up to the Sunung, but now that the exam is over, authorities have finally been able to allow this transition to happen.
Right. Yeon-sung, I understand students who've been fully vaccinated will likely face less disruptions in their school attendance. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Right, you're absolutely right. Schools have been tweaking their school policies accordingly to the fact that some of their students have been vaccinated. So those aged 16 and 17 were eligible for jabs since last month, and children aged 12 to 15 began getting vaccinated on the 1st of November. So now, if a student has been fully vaccinated and has proof of a negative PCR test, they can still come into class even if their family members or any of their cohabitants test positive for COVID-19 or go into isolation. So now students are less likely to miss out on their education.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Yeon-sung, what are the areas perhaps of greatest concern for health authorities amid the full resumption of in-person learning at schools?
Well, some are still having their doubts whether this is the right time at the right decision, whether this decision came at a timely manner. So for one, vaccination rates among teenagers are still not that high. A little over 40% of those aged 16 to 17 were inoculated, while only less than 1% of children from 12 to 15 have completed their jabs. It's quite the contrast compared to the vaccination rates among adults sitting at over 90%, but it still hasn't been long since vaccination started for these younger age groups. So authorities are hoping that the vaccination rates will climb as the school semester progresses. The spike in infections that the country has been seeing lately has also been one of the concerns. As Seoul just filled us in with the latest COVID tally, the recent spike in cases to above 3,000 daily infections has also been triggering worries.
Right. What then, or what measures, Yeon-seung, are there that authorities are thinking about then to ensure a safe learning experience now that schools are fully open?
Well, for one, there's going to be about 1,800 inspection officers dispatched to some 600 schools in the capital region to make sure all prevention measures are being followed. Authorities have also devised up a plan to comb through facilities like PC rooms, private academies, and singing rooms, places where students often visit after school, so that they can strengthen measures in those areas as well.
For out-of-school facilities, we'll operate a school life prevention and inspection team until the end of the year that involves about 1,300 staff from local governments, education offices, and parents to make sure students safely partake in after-school activities.
Right, I see. One final question. Yeon-seung, what's the latest situation regarding our ICU bed capacity, especially here in the metropolitan region?
Well, I'm sure you remember in last week's report that I kept on saying that it was a very serious problem at the time. Well, the beds are filling up rather quickly, even more so than last week. Over the weekend, ICU beds in the Greater Seoul region filled up to more than 80% capacity, breaking above that 80% mark for the first time ever. This figure has been jumping close to 2 percentage points each day, and on Monday, more than 83% of beds have filled up in the capital area. More than 900 people had to wait for their beds on Monday, and for each day during this past weekend, more than 100 people have been added to that waiting list.
I see. All right, Yeon-seung, thank you for now, but stay with us for the broader talks. Right, authorities in Austria have opted for a complete lockdown, and for more on the situation there and elsewhere, I have Soa back at the desk. Soa.
Hi, Sunny. So yes, amid record high COVID-19 figures, Austria has become the first Western European country that has re-entered a full lockdown, which means strict social distancing measures that were existent before vaccinations started. Public life will come to a 20-day halt starting Monday, with all but essential shops to close and citizens ordered to work from home. Austrian officials are aiming to prevent a fifth wave of the virus, with recent COVID-19 infections having surged to around 1,000 per 100,000 people over the past week. Around 66% of Austria's population is fully vaccinated, one of the lowest rates in Europe. The strict lockdown will be re-evaluated in 10 days from now, and after 20 days, it may be applied to the unvaccinated. Until then, this will be under effect.
An all-day curfew for everyone in Austria. Schools and kindergartens will remain open. Exceptional reasons for leaving home are those already known. Averting of danger to life and property, meeting necessary basic needs, professional and educational purposes, staying outdoors for physical and mental recreation, and for official or judicial routes that cannot be postponed.
What's also going to be a first in Europe is mandatory vaccination. So Austria decided to make vaccinations a legal requirement starting in February next year. Now, there are some mixed responses regarding these latest measures.
The lockdown was foreseeable. I actually don't mind being at home. I have a job which I can do from home. It doesn't bother me much, but I will miss the cafe, of course.
We're against the lockdown and the Austrian government policies as far as the coronavirus goes. This has been going on for 2 years and there's no end in sight. Something new is announced every day and we don't know what we can believe anymore. That's the situation.
Right. And so I understand many are taking to the streets even beyond Austria in light of decisions to reimpose restrictions.
Yes, Sunny, tens of thousands of protesters in Europe took to the streets over the weekend. In Austria's capital, Vienna, for instance, thousands of them, many of them being from far-right groups, gathered at Heldenplatz Square on Saturday, demanding freedom, their fundamental rights and democracy. While police used loudspeakers to tell demonstrators to wear face masks, most of the crowd ignored the orders. Over in Belgium, some 35,000 people were estimated to have taken part at a rally in central Brussels on Sunday, which turned violent against newly imposed restrictions, as well as in protest against the government's vaccine recommendation and a possible introduction of vaccine mandates there as well. In the Netherlands, police arrested over 50 people during unrest in The Hague and other towns on Sunday after violence broke out at a demonstration against COVID-19 measures that kicked in the previous day. Police say several officers were injured as well. Daily protests erupted over recent weeks in Croatia, with some 15,000 counted in its capital Zagreb on Saturday, mainly against COVID-19 passports that restrict unvaccinated citizens from entering public facilities.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, so over in the US, I understand there are fresh concerns over possible resurgences with Thanksgiving coming up.
Right, Sunny, that would be Thursday this week, with traveling for many of those having already started last week. So according to the U.S. Transportation Security Administration, around 20 million air passengers are expected during this year's Thanksgiving travel period, so from last Friday, November 19th until November 28th. That meaning the number of passengers will be very close to pre-pandemic levels. An official says the highest number of people that flew in a single day stood at 2.2 million during the pandemic, with that record expected to be broken. The long holiday weekend, higher vaccinations, as well as a recent lifting of travel restrictions for the fully vaccinated is expected to result in massive travel volume on air as well as on the roads. But there are some concerns, as you mentioned, because infections in the U.S. recently actually went up for the first time in weeks, now standing at an average of close to 100,000 a day. And also top infectious disease expert Anthony Fauci warned of a surge after the holidays.
I see. Meanwhile, back on the academic front, our Yun-sung spoke about the opening of the academic front here on the local front. But tell us a bit about how schools are faring elsewhere, Yun-sung, for the sake of comparison.
Right, so most countries across the world have resumed in-person learning, at least partially or whether it be fully. But a lot of these places have also seen a spike in cases among the younger age demographic. So let's take a look at Germany's case, for example. The country has been seeing a steep rise in infections, reaching over 60,000 cases for the first time last week. And infections among young students have partially been fueling the spread. According to German health authorities, children aged 10 to 14 have shown the highest 7-day incidence rate last week, followed by 5 to 9-year-olds, and then those in the 15 to 19 age group. So you can really see that the young teenagers are being really vulnerable to the virus right now. But German authorities are ruling out any disruptions to in-person learning as they pass a new law that bans widespread school closures. The U.S. is another country where schools have fully opened their doors since September, and for a while the virus spreading rapidly among children and teenagers has also been the country's main concerns. In an effort to dampen the spread, they've recently started rolling out COVID-19 vaccinations for those aged 5 to 11. So as you can see, it's been a really tough balancing act for many countries trying to juggle the needs of safety and education at the same time.
Right, of course, I'd have to agree with you right there. So what more can you tell us about vaccinations for the younger population meanwhile?
Well, following the U.S., as Yun-sung mentioned, now Israel will be the next one to roll out its vaccinations for this younger population aged 5 to 11. That will begin on Tuesday, and they will also get the Pfizer doses. Now, officials there say that the country is on the verge of what seems to be a wave of children infections, so highly recommending these shots for these kids for the sake of their safety and health. Now, others that have approved or are offering doses for this younger population is the United Arab Emirates, Cambodia, Colombia, and Cuba as well.
I see. All right, so as always, thank you very much for that coverage, and Yun-sung, thank you for your input. President Moon Jae-in hosted a town hall Sunday evening and pledged to dedicate the remainder of his term in office to better containing COVID-19. Our Blue House correspondent Kimchi reports.
President Moon Jae-in says the final 6 months of his term will be spent managing the COVID-19 situation to get people's lives completely back to normal. His remarks came Sunday evening during a 100-minute-long televised town hall meeting. The 300-member audience were selected in consideration of region, age, and gender. 200 of them had been fully vaccinated joining the president on site, with the remainder connecting with the president online.
아직은 조금 조마조마한 부분이 있습니다. 그러나 끝까지 이 단계적 일상 회복 잘 진행해서 완전한 일상 회복 이루고 또 끝까지 국정을 잘 마무리할 수 있도록 최선을 다하겠습니다. 매일매일이 위기관리 연속이라는 걸 생각하면 6개월은 결코 짧은 기간이 아닙니다. 굉장히 많은 일이 일어날 수 있는 그런 기간이라고 생각합니다.
President Moon said the greatest concern is the uptick of critically ill patients, with the figure now over 500. South Korea has also seen the number of daily COVID-19 infections top 3,000 over the past few days. The president stressed the need for boosters to ease the situation in general and to prevent breakthrough infections.
정부는 한 5,000명 또는 10,000명 정도까지도 확진자 수가 늘어날 수 있다고 생각하면서 대비를 했었고요. 다만 이제 위중증 환자가 좀 빠르게 늘어나서 그 바람에 병상 상황이 조금 빠듯하게 된 것이 조금 염려가 됩니다. 지금은 이제 병상을 빠르게 늘리고 또 의료 인력을 확충해서 우리 의료 체계가 감당할 수 있게끔 만들고 또 한편으로는 취약한 분들에게 추가 접종을 빠르게 실시해서 전체적으로 접종 효과를 높여주는 것이 필요하다고 생각하고요.
The president added that the government will also expand vaccinations for children if they are deemed safe, taking overseas cases into account. He said South Korea is also working to secure oral antiviral treatments.
5세부터 11세까지 이 부분에 대해서도 미국에서는 지금 시행을 하기 시작했습니다. 그것이 안전하고 효과가 있다고 판단되면 한국도 백신 접종 연령을 낮추어 나가도록 하겠습니다. 해외에서 지금 먹는 치료제가 두 종류가 개발이 되었기 때문에 우리가 성구매 계약을 체결했습니다. 40만 명분 구매 계약을 체결했는데 늦어도 내년 2월에는 들어올 계획이고요.
As for what he regrets the most, President Moon said it's a real estate issue, with young people and newlyweds still unable to buy their own homes due to skyrocketing housing prices. He said the government will do its best so the burden is not carried over to the next administration.
정부는 남은 기간 동안 하락 안정세까지 이렇게 목표를 두고 있습니다. 다음 정부에까지 그 어려움이 넘어가지 않도록 해결의 실마리는 확실히 임기 마지막까지 이렇게 찾도록 하겠습니다. 불로소득이라든지 그다음에 또 초과이익 그걸 환수할 수 있는 그리고 또 그런 그 민간 업자들이 과다한 이익을 누리지 못하게 하는 그런 여러 가지 대책들을 요 근래에 부동산과 관련된 여러 문제들이 생기면서 정부가 집중적으로 검토를 하고 있고.
On the COVID-19 emergency relief payments, President Moon said he supported the decision of his cabinet to provide tailored support. There had been a dispute between the government and ruling party. The government said support should be given to the most vulnerable, while the ruling party pushed for funds for everyone. President Moon concluded by asking the people to be proud, saying South Korea now ranks in the world's top 10 in various areas, including the economy, democracy, defense, culture, and healthcare. He said it's not just self-praise but the assessment of the global community, stressing that it's this pride that will drive the country's future development. Kimchi, Arirang News.
Also on the local front, owners of large real estate are getting tax bills for their sizable assets starting this week. Our Ji-young tells us what this means.
With soaring real estate prices in South Korea, the amount of comprehensive real estate holding tax could reach an all-time high figure. People or businesses with large real estate assets are being notified of their tax bills starting on Monday. The Ministry of Economy and Finance announced that the gross real estate tax that they're sending out bills for this year comes to around $4.8 billion. This is triple the amount from last year, which was about $1.5 billion. Also, the number of people subject to comprehensive tax for holding real estate rose dramatically. Around 950,000 people were notified that they would have to pay gross real estate tax for this year, up 42% compared to last year. This is the first bill since the government proposed raising the threshold for property tax to ease the burden on single homeowners in August. The government raised the bar for paying the tax from about $750,000 to a little over $900,000. But with home prices in South Korea, especially in Seoul, having risen dramatically in the past months, many more single homeowners still fall above this new threshold. However, the Ministry of Finance said Monday that 98% of taxpayers are not subject to the tax, adding that multiple homeowners will pay a large part of the total. Multiple homeowners and corporations account for around 90% of the amount of tax notified. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Meanwhile, Korea's BTS has won the Artist of the Year title at this year's American Music Awards. Now, BTS stands as the first not just from Korea but from Asia to ever make that shortlist and to win. This title was the group's third for the night on Sunday in Los Angeles, following its Favorite Pop Group Award and Favorite Pop Song recognition for its mega hit Butter. Now, BTS has brought home at least one award from this annual music event since its first nomination back in 2018. The group is also among the Grammy nominations, which will be announced later this week. And staying with wins by Koreans on the international arena, Ko Jin-young secured the LPGA Tour Championship as well as the Player of the Year award this past Sunday. Our Ian Jin has the highlights.
On Sunday, the LPGA's final competition of the season was played out in Naples, Florida. With a four-way tie going into the final round, it was South Korea's Ko Jin-young that came out victorious, finishing on 23 under par to win the CME Group Tour Championship title for the second straight year. This marks Ko's fifth LPGA win in 2021 and the 12th victory of her career. And Ko's effort to becoming the CME Globe Champion has been well compensated. Her first-place finish earned her the largest winner's check in LPGA history at $1.5 million. With the win, Ko also became Rolex Player of the Year by a narrow margin over Nelly Korda, finishing with 211 points to Korda's 197 points. After months of back and forth this season between Ko and Korda at the top of the world rankings, Ko finished the season as the top female earner for the third year straight and her second Player of the Year honor. With 5 wins, Ko also won more tournaments than any other player this season. Ian Jin, Arirang News.
November 22nd, that is today, marks Kimchi Day. And to better commemorate this occasion, our Kim Bo-kyung shares with us efforts by kimchi fans abroad to better incorporate this dish into their dining experiences.
Sometimes it balances the taste of rich food, and sometimes it adds loud, punchy flavors. Kimchi is Korea's own distinctive cornerstone cuisine, and apparently it is now attracting global gourmets. International foodies are not only enjoying the flavor, but also making their own unique dishes using kimchi as the main ingredient. A recently held kimchi cook-off in California attracted more than 300 participants to the event. Carlotta Bradley was the grand prize winner with her unique Chonggim rice stack. She got to know about kimchi thanks to her Korean friend, and now she has been so mesmerized by its sourness, sweetness, and crunchiness that she uses kimchi everywhere in her cooking.
You know, people think that kimchi is always spicy, like the same brand, you know, like the pogi kimchi. But there's the regular flavor that has not spices in it, that's more mild. And I created this like cupcake with the pogi kimchi. Amazing. I'm telling you, kimchi is so playful, I call it. So nice, such a nice ingredient to play around with when you're looking for new flavors to add.
A healthy and well-rounded ingredient. But people should note kimchi isn't just limited to being an ingredient. One of the cook-off judges and the main host of the PBS-produced travelogue Kimchi Chronicles, Marja Wangersten, says kimchi also shows Korea's national characteristics.
We suffered at the hands of the Chinese, Japanese, and Mongols. And I think kimchi is a great dish to represent Korea because it's so resilient, right? It lasts and endures if you take care of it. You know, if you store it properly, if you make sure it's got all the things that it needs. And that's the love.
Once people are into food, guiding them to be more into culture and history is rather easy, Marja says. And so she adds there should be more content available regarding Korea's own long history.
We need to really start talking about not just the shiny stuff that's happened in the last 30 years, the LG, the Samsung, the money, the wealth. We got to talk about all of our pain and our stories and history that you guys have learned growing up there that the rest of the world knows nothing about.
Korea is catching the interest of the world in many ways these days. And with food being one of the pillars of Korean culture, why don't you try a bite of kimchi today? Kim Bo-kyung, Arirang News.
Come January next year, New York City will usher in its most diverse city council, which also boasts a female majority for the first time ever. Having said that, I now have Linda Lee, a member-elect of the council, who's also one of 2 Korean Americans elected to it. It's a pleasure to have you with us, Linda, and congratulations on your win.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me tonight.
Right. Linda, let's start perhaps with a few words on this remarkable event.
Sure. Well, I have to say it hasn't quite hit me just yet. It is definitely historic for many, many reasons. Myself, as well as Julie Won, we are the first Korean Americans ever elected to the city council. And it is such a historic win for many reasons. And for me personally, in my district, I actually am the first woman and person of color to ever win the race in the city council seat.
Right.
So it's a lot, yeah.
It is. Linda, what was the immediate reaction among those around you, including your family, your friends, your co-workers, with regard to your win?
I think everyone was ecstatic, excited. My coworkers maybe were not so happy because that means I'm going to be leaving the organization. But, you know, I think my family has seen me work so extremely hard for this race. Lots of knocking on doors every single day, pretty much since February. And so it has been a long, hard-fought journey. There were a lot of great candidates in the race. And so I think it was just this sense of, wow, it's finally here. And, you know, I have to admit, there was even for me a sense of doubt because, you know, as the first woman, person of color, there's always that sense of, oh, maybe some people are not ready yet for an Asian American woman to be in the district and to lead. So it's an honor, truly, and a privilege.
Right. So, Linda, like you said, you are the first woman and the first person of color to represent Council District 23 in Eastern Queens. What would you say are the implications of this reality?
There is a lot of pressure, not in a bad way, but I find it in a good way. I want to represent people well. And I think for the first time, there is a sense of, wow, you know, here is someone who reflects me, right? Like women, I think, you know, who make up the large portion of people who actually vote in the district. You know, I think they were super excited and happy to be able to see a fellow woman win the district seat for once and for the first time. And I think also, as a person of color, you know, my district specifically, it's almost 50% Asian American. And so it's actually the second highest concentration of Asian Americans next to the Flushing area, which has the most. And so there's a lot of immigrant groups. There's a lot of Asian groups that are looking to me. And for the first time, they feel like, wow, here's someone who has been through a lot of the struggles and experiences that our families have gone through. And so I think there's excitement because there, across the city, I think there's different faces, different representation for the first time. So it's exciting.
Right. As you said, America's great diversity, Linda, has not always been reflected in its leadership. And having said that, could you tell us a bit about the pledges that you believe may have resonated with those who voted for you?
Sure. I actually think a lot of the pledges that I noticed, especially when door knocking, we knocked over 30,000 doors across the district in a very short period of time. I myself probably knocked on about 8,000. And what I have found actually across the board, no matter who you talk to, whether you're, from the Black community, the Asian immigrant community, the white community, is that, people in this area of Queens, they really care about just good schools, good education, safe streets, making sure that their neighborhoods are clean. So very basic things that impact quality of life. Property taxes, of course, is a huge issue here in New York City. And so these are all issues that I think no matter which ethnic group or which population you're talking about, these are issues that everyone cares about across the city. And so I think for me, the policies that I was trying to reflect, and discuss were actually very much reflective of the district as well. So, in that sense, I think people were excited, like, oh, hey, here's someone who's younger, who comes into the district with fresh ideas, hopefully, but still the core of it is still the same.
Right. Linda, you mentioned that you're currently still heading the non-profit organization. I believe it's called the Korean Community Services. Could you tell us a bit about the work of your entity and perhaps any future plans with Korea, with some campaign that you might be having with the country itself here?
Sure. Yes. So I've been at KCS Korean Community Services for the last 12 years. And I have to say that has been the most humbling experience of my life. And it's interesting because a lot of my friends personally would have probably described me as a Twinkie, right? Because I'm very Americanized inside, but at the same time, when this job opportunity came up, I really wanted to give back to the community. I really wanted to, I thought about my grandmother who raised me and my sister because my parents were small business owners. They owned dry cleaners. And, in working at KCS, I learned so much, and I was able to start the first outpatient mental health clinic in New York City and New York State that is run by a Korean nonprofit organization, which is a growing concern, in the U.S. here, not just in the Korean community, but all over. And especially with the after effects of the pandemic. But, we have the only senior services that are in Korean, the only Korean food Meals on Wheels program. And the cook at KCS, who retired recently, was 93 when she retired, and she was at KCS for about 30 years. And so there's a lot of deep roots and history in this organization where the first wave of Korean immigrants who came to New York City noticed that there are no services in Korean language and there's no culturally competent services. And so they really had that mission of providing all sorts of services from youth to seniors, adult literacy classes, ESL classes, workforce job training programs. They really laid such a great foundation. And I felt like, when I came in, I was the only second generation Korean American to actually be working at KCS. And for the last 12 years, I've seen it grow. I've seen the beauty in diversity of the Korean diaspora and intergenerational staff and how amazing that can be, but tough at the same time. But really, it's such an amazing growing experience. And we've been able to grow the organization so much. We now are in 6 locations. We just moved into a larger community center back in 2017. And our budget right now is nearly $9 million in New York City. And so we've really garnered, I think, the trust and support of the community. And during the pandemic, we became a vaccine site.
Right. Oh, I see. Right.
Yeah.
Linda, one final question before you leave us. Could we have a few words, perhaps, on your goals once you're in office starting next year?
Sure. So I think next year, definitely trying to push language access, because what we saw very clearly from the pandemic is that if you don't speak English, if you don't know how to use the computer, you're automatically left out of a lot of the city programs that are available to the community. And we have a lot of hard work to do throughout this recovery process that the city is still going through. And so however we can help small business owners, the immigrant community, senior services is big because, my district has no transit and lots of older adults. And so I think in this recovery stage, as we move out of the pandemic, we're really, really focusing on how do we reflect policies that hit and impact the most marginalized communities in the city. So that's definitely something that we're going to be trying to focus on.
All right, Linda. All right, then our best wishes to you as you embark on your new journey. And thank you very much for making the time to join us live at this very late hour at your end.
Oh, no, thank you so much. It was an honor.
Korea's exit strategy from the pandemic is being met with a few challenges, ranging from a higher number of patients in critical care, as well as a persistent number of fatalities and a greater burden on the medical arena, especially here in the metropolitan region. For more on the local situation, I have Professor Chung Gi-seok from Hallym University. It's a pleasure to have you back, Professor Chung.
Thanks for having me.
I also have Professor David Kwak from Sooncheng University. Welcome back, Professor Kwak.
Good afternoon, Sunny.
Professor Chung, we are entering week 4 of our gradual transition into a new normal. Our daily tally has been hovering on the 3,000 level. It's dropped slightly from that level on this Monday, but the number of severe cases stands on the 500 level as is. How do you assess Korea's COVID-19 situation at the moment?
Well, we started living with corona from November 1st, but before that, from 18th October, government allowed private gathering on the east one, and we saw lots of people gathered Halloween day. So after 3 weeks, we are seeing daily tallies about 3,000, and 500 people, patients are admitting to hospital every day, and more than that, 800 more patients are waiting for admission after 20 hours after diagnosis. So it's not an easy condition, even though the good news is the vaccination completion rate is 80%. But we know that there are many people without any immunity or very low immunity, particularly aged over 60. And particularly among them, 60 and 74 had the AstraZeneca vaccine, which has a very low immunity after completion of vaccination. So the social distance level very east is very low. And there are many people with a lower immunity in our society. So we are heading for worse before we are getting better.
And talking about heading for the worst, Professor Kwak, there is talk that our daily tally may hit 4,000 this week. Do you share this outlook?
Well, it'll depend on the situation, obviously. As Professor Chung already mentioned, we've started seeing rather ease in the keeping of restrictions before it actually began in the process. As Professor Chung mentioned, we began noticing people gathering more and not abiding by the strictest social distancing guide that we used to have back in October. Starting in the latter half of the month or so, we began obviously loosening up in the keeping of the restrictions, as well as, just among ourselves, keeping less of the guidelines. That started, I think, taking up on the confirmation cases, and obviously that'll take tolls in the occupancy in the ICU bed units as well. So I think we're seeing really the accumulation of all those happening in the prior 2 months or so, rather than what's really happening just at the moment. So I think there is still a chance that we might see the confirmation cases number go higher up even further, because after the government started the scheme of living with corona, people were I'm not sure if this word is appropriate, but became completely loose. We sort of went back to the usual lives that we used to have even before the pandemic. I'm pretty sure all the watchers currently, and you and myself, have noticed through the past week or so that the traffic jam has gotten worsened. that pretty much symbolizes how loose we are in regards to really keeping the distancing guidelines for ourselves, let alone coming into contact with other people. So I think there is a great chance that we might see numbers further up. I'm just hoping for the best that we won't see the occupancy rate in the ICU beds will go further up either.
Right. And given the picture that Professor Kwak has just painted, Professor Chung, do you suppose then we need to reimpose tougher prevention measures here on the local front?
Well, I think the situation is urgent and we are passing through a very critical period, but the government persists on doing the same policy, even though we have lots of patients, even the severe patients. The weekly report started from last week, and the government is saying the modest risk is here in Greater Seoul area, which nobody really believed that. So the pattern they are looking at, the parameter is looking back, not looking up, looking forward. So we need to look forward to hold the situation. Last week we have almost 20,000 confirmed cases, and then with that amount of patients, we'll see in a week time severe patients multiply by 2%, 400 severe patients will be admitting to a hospital. We have to prepare for those people. We don't need to look back. So I don't know whether they will say a modest risk or a high risk today, but it doesn't matter. We have to look forward, and we have to prepare all ICU beds and for those patients. So what is most important is preparedness for critically ill patients. And also, we have to pay attention to non-COVID patients. There are many people who are very ill and cannot come to hospital because of obstacles. And because of delayed diagnosis, they may lose the chance of getting an operation, getting an appropriate laboratory and procedure. So it's quite complicated from now on. So I'm quite afraid of that.
Right, it really isn't an easy matter at all.
Right.
Professor Kwak, medical capacity is running at over 80% here in the metropolitan region, which is why authorities are now exploring the option of quick transfers of COVID-19 patients to hospitals outside of the capital region, perhaps within an hour. How feasible is this option, in your opinion?
Well, this is kind of what I said that in the last week when I was asked a very similar question. So it has been done before in the beginning phase of the pandemic when we weren't really ready to handle a very drastic situation like that. But we had to disperse patients being admitted to ICUs all over the nation because a certain sector or a certain region could not handle a drastic increase in the numbers. I think that's what's happening again, and it's the best alternative to really just blocking off anybody from being admitted to ICU any further. So that has to be done, whether it's feasible or not, because different medical sectors has to be sort of eased from the toll that or the capacity that they're currently taking care of the patients being admitted to ICU beds. I personally think there's a missing link here. In this drastic transition from a very strict social distancing to almost no social distancing, but rather recommending people to protect themselves. So through the past weekend, I've received numerous calls from different people asking me that their acquaintances have been diagnosed, but they're going through mild cases, but they're having such and such symptoms, whether or not they can be treated. So we are still isolating these mildly infected patients at home, but we're not being able to really treat them so that they won't go further in their progress. I think that's the missing link here. If in a transition to dealing with the case numbers or the load of case numbers, if we want to really still minimize the further input into the ICU beds, we need to also have a way to stop the progress into the severe cases. And that is to obviously treat mildly infected people early on in their phases, such as treating them them with maybe remdesivir, maybe antibody treatments, or maybe even providing them steroids if they need them, depending on their situations, obviously. But I think the government has to come up with a additional method that could sort of fill in the missing link, and possibly, because they have said that these higher numbers of confirmation cases was to be expected already, if they're not solely going to depend on the confirmation case numbers, but instead only the ICU bed numbers, then they should come up with a method to minimize that ICU bed fill-up rate in the systematic manner too.
Right. And talking about coming up with such efforts, such preparations, Professor Chung, what would you propose to better deal with this burden on the medical arena?
Well, the government is pushing the hospitals and doctors to get the patient as soon as possible, and doctors should obey that. But there are some circumstances that the doctors or hospital cannot follow their order. Because, for instance, there could be a cardiopulmonary resuscitation in the ICU, and all the doctors and nurses have to focus on that. Then they have no time and no place to get the new patients, which is ordered from the government. And there is a sub-ICU along with the ICU. And in sub-ICU, there are also many patients who are very critically ill. And they are on the process of a very deteriorating process. And then the doctors in that hospital have to reserve ICU beds for those people. So that's another reason why they cannot get the order. So, and even though the ICU inpatients, there are PCR negative COVID-19 patients, but they have suffering from a cardiovascular problem, neurologic deficit, kidney failure, and etc. That there are many reasons why the doctors cannot follow their order, but they just like to push the order. So I like to recommend the government just stand back and leave it to an intensivist. And government should play a role, the connecting and coordination between the life treatment center, regional hospital, and ICUs. And the second recommendation is make a hub ICU hospital. So there are quite many hospitals are participating in ICU care. They are taking care of 10 patients or 20 patients. But if you put all together, make 100 beds or 200 beds, and the doctors go to that hub hospital, then you can save human resources. And some ICUs, I mean the most ICUs, cannot do a certain procedure, certain laboratory, or certain operation due to a contamination. But if you make a hub hospital ICU, then you can do anything within the hospital. You can do a laboratory work, procedure, operation, etc. That's the best way to save the human resources and do more good to ICU patients.
I see. Meanwhile, in the absence of such a hub medical center then, Professor Kwak, how do you respond to calls for the possible adoption of an emergency mode here in the metropolitan region, which accounts for the majority of daily COVID-19 infections?
Well, I don't think they're going to take it really, because they have been stating, as Dr. Jung mentioned, this is a modest risk to the medical sector currently. Different views, obviously, from different people. But at least from the government's point of view, nationally speaking, I think they're judging that it's manageable. I would hope so. I would certainly hope so. So if we can pass this phase without having to go back to, let's say, more stricter social distancing or complete blockage of the metropolitan area, I think it'll be the best method. But to do that, as Dr. Chung mentioned, and me insisting as well, we need to come up with a more systemic approach where we can fill in the blanks of what's missing currently. As Dr. Jung mentioned, whether that be for a hub sub-ICU bed center, or for those people, as I said, treating patients more early on in their phases so that to minimize the risk of them progressing into severe diseases, the government has to give the professionals, the ICU doctors, the doctor specialists who have very good knowledge over this to handle the matter more professionally. So I think there needs to be a space that's created for the specialists, maybe a committee or maybe even a conference, so that to come up with a protocol, to come up with answers and alternatives to better handle the situation currently as well.
Right. Meanwhile, Professor Chung, schools nationwide are offering in-person classes to all students as of this Monday. What worries you most about this reality, the full resumption of schools?
Yeah, you have to worry about they're getting infection and they're spreading infection in school. But Ministry of Education has already reported that the school is the most safe area, because they surveyed the infected students, and they found that the most popular area, most vulnerable area was their home, and other facilities like a PC bank and etc. So school seems to be the most safe one. So the one thing in school, they have to keep mask wearing and hand hygiene and the ventilation. So even though it's getting cold, you need to ventilate very frequently. With those things in mind, then I think it's not very worrisome if students are going to school and face-to-face lesson. If they stay at home, it is more dangerous. So school is safer than the other environments.
Right, and ventilation is very important, which is something that Professor Kwok has been talking about over and over again. Professor Kwok, one final question to you. What are your thoughts on the possible offering of COVID-19 vaccines to children aged 5 to 11 here in the country, as is the case over in the US and Israel? Very briefly speaking.
Well, as you mentioned, they already began doing that in many other countries. I think it's recommendable. I don't think it can be mandatable, however, because as we have seen from the studies before, those among ages 5 to 12 are not as vulnerable than adults to the disease itself, and also they're about half as much spreading to others. So in a way, epidemiologically speaking, we should target people who are more vulnerable, more transmissible in the disease. So I think the focus of the vaccination should focus rather on much elderly generations and also possibly more active generations, such as the teenagers, rather than 5 to 12 years old. But still, for their own protection, it's still strongly recommendable.
Right, and of course, your thoughts are about here, the local front, of course, in the country. All right, Professor Kwok, as always, thank you very much for your thoughts, and Professor Chung, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you.
Right, as mentioned earlier, we are entering the 4th week of efforts to adopt a new normal here in the country. Do seek to do your part to ensure a sustainable adoption amid the ongoing pandemic.
지겨운가요? 힘든가요? 숨이 턱까지 찼나요? 모두가 최선을 다하고 있는 이 힘든 시기에도 분명 끝은 있을 테니까.